Public Radio's conversation about belief, meaning, ethics, and ideas. Today, progressive Islam in America. There are an estimated 6 million Muslims in America. And in recent years, scrutiny of the religion of Islam has become part and parcel of our public life. As terrorist attacks continue around the world, many ask, is violence at the heart of Islam? Can Islam reconcile itself with modernity? Can it flourish within democracy? This hour, we'll speak with a spectrum of American Muslims who describe themselves as devout, moderate, and progressive. Michael Wolff is an author and filmmaker who converted to Islam over 2 decades ago. Precious Rashida Muhammad is a third-generation African-American Muslim. Keisha Ali is a rising scholar of feminist ethics. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. We begin with Omid Safi, an Iranian-American theologian.
You still hear from a lot of people, why aren't the moderate Muslims speaking out? And at some level, you just you feel like, I've lost my voice from speaking out.
Omid Safi is a professor of religious studies at Colgate University. Although he traces his heritage to a long line of Persian poets and mystics, he was born in this country, and he is immersed with other American Muslims in an urgent dialogue to carve out what he calls a spiritual community of the middle. His book, Progressive Muslims, brings together an array of Islamic perspectives on democracy, pluralism, and gender. Omid Safi concedes that there are rigid extremes at both ends of Muslim reality, the Wahhabis of al-Qaeda on the one hand, and on the other, secular Muslims who would adopt Western values uncritically. Yet of himself and his fellow American Muslims, he writes, most of us find ourselves in the gloriously messy middle, where real folks live and breathe.
It's messy. It's messy in that middle, and it's also like a game of dodgeball. You get hit from all sides, but I'm convinced that it's not just a middle ground. It's also in some ways a higher ground.
I wonder what you have felt you needed to speak out about or critique within Islam, with other Muslims, about Islam in these last couple of years.
Oh, well, there are a number of different areas. One of them is sort of in the aftermath of 9/11, you have seen kind of an ebb and flow of extremism in terms of al-Qaeda and things of that sort. Yeah. But you've also seen this opening where all of a sudden you don't find many Muslims who feel comfortable identifying themselves as Wahhabi anymore.
Okay.
It's the kind of ultra-conservative movement that starts in Saudi Arabia in the 18th century. And while it is dogmatically anti-Western, anti-Jewish, anti-Christian, actually more than anything, it's anti-other Muslims.
Okay.
And throughout history, and well before 9/11, Wahhabi extremists have killed many, many times more Muslims than they have ever killed non-Muslims. They've killed Shi'i Muslims, Sufi Muslims, non-Saudi Muslims. So they have a long history of genocide. So, on one hand, I think we're speaking out, against those particular groups. And on the other hand, I think what we're doing, and this is not a comfortable thing to do, but the time for comfort has passed, is to talk about all the uncomfortable issues. On all the ones that, and I'll use the pronoun we here, we Muslims generally don't want to talk about publicly. We rather talk about them inside our own confined spaces.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about issues of gender justice. We're talking about what does it mean to have communities in which women are not guaranteed the absolute full dignity that they are entitled to as human beings. What does it mean to have communities in which, in spite of all the Islamic ethical teachings of universal brotherhood and sisterhood, there are deep and abiding class divisions and racial divisions? And these are things that us Muslims don't like to talk about publicly, or have not liked to talk about publicly. But I also sense a change. And I'm confident in that change. And part of it is a generational issue. And for those of us who happen to be both American and Muslim, part of it is a sense of, this is what us modern creatures do, is we are probing and prodding and critiquing and never too comfortable in any one place. And so as Muslims, we're no exceptions. But those conversations being had out loud and out in the open, that's a new thing for the Muslim community.
Give me some examples of where you're seeing that or what it looks like, where it's taking place.
One of the most interesting places for it is the virtual realm, the internet. This has completely, I think, changed the way that we are having difficult conversations about spiritual and communal and social issues. And there's a level of anonymity that the internet affords us that, we don't have to come face to face with someone who may be bigger than us or richer than us
or meaner.
Or meaner.
Yeah.
And they can't shout us down quite as easily. And so one of the things that I've noticed is the incredible number of younger Muslims who, just as, they are completely savvy in terms of technology and MP3s and that whole realm, that they're also carrying out their intellectual conversations on the internet. So there's a mushrooming of listservs and chat rooms where people are carrying out these kinds of debates and discussions. And this is new.
Okay.
This is new. And you're also seeing it being carried out in the quote-unquote real world as well. And people are also trying to figure out, how do we build inclusive communities that are inclusive racial-wise, sexual-wise, gender-wise, class-wise, in all those kinds of senses. And the fact that they're being done deliberately and explicitly, I think makes it an exciting time.
Well, and there is this spate of books, and I keep becoming aware of more of them. I mean, there's your volume, Progressive Muslims, and there's Michael Wolff's Taking Back Islam, and Khaled Abou El Fadl's Tolerant Islam. I mean, and these are all collections of many, many Muslim voices.
That's right. That is one exciting aspect of it. And the folks who are participating in conversations, I think, come from a good range of the spectrum of Muslim voices. What's interesting, though, and this is one reason that I think there's both listening and not listening going on, is that parallel to these set of books, you have the whole other set of Islamophobic kind of voices out there, people like Bernard Lewis and Samuel Huntington and Daniel Pipes and a lot of the neoconservative types who it's almost as if the books that you just mentioned, the Progressive Muslim book and Michael Wolff's work and Khaled Abou Fadl's and Asma Gul Hassan's and so many other people, as if we don't exist. It's kind of this chorus of there is a deafening silence of moderate Muslims. Talk about things that anger one. Because I think that to refuse to acknowledge the voice and the conscience of other human beings is an incredible act of barbarism.
Muslim theologian Omid Safi. Omid Safi has been a key voice in a growing movement that sometimes calls itself Progressive Islam. For him, this entails critical thinking both about Islam and about American culture. For example, he says, sweeping portrayals of the Muslim world, such as naming entire countries as evil, undermine the constructive influence American Muslims are seeking to exercise in other parts of the world.
One thing that as Muslims we're having to do is to stand up to those extremists who would characterize all Americans as being evil.
Right.
And we're saying that, no, you can't go around demonizing a whole civilization and a whole group of humanity. And using that logic, we have to also stand up to people who would characterize an entire nation as belonging somehow to this axis of evil, as if everyone there is evil, or even every act of their government is evil. So I think one has to be consistent. about it. And I don't find that kind of totalizing and generalizing to be a compassionate act and to be a helpful act in bringing humanity together.
You've also spoken about something you call pamphlet Islam and web Islam as problematic. And, you just talked about things happening on the web that feel good to you and exciting. But what are these things you're concerned about? What's pamphlet Islam and web Islam?
There's something very appealing about the process of offering short and quick answers to very complicated problems. In the case of Islam, when you walk into many Islamic centers, you see at the front desk or on the wall somewhere these ludicrous kinds of pamphlets, the position of women in Islam, the role of Jesus in Islam, the concept of God in Islam. And what it does is it takes 1,400 years of history and an incredibly rich and diverse spectrum of interpretation and practice and picks one of them and represents it as the Islamic take on things. It never tells you where in the spectrum it comes from. It just becomes the Islamic take on something. And collapsing that rich spectrum is a crime because it's precisely that fluidity of Islamic interpretation and practice that people find so useful. It's been one of the great hallmarks of the Islamic tradition that you've always have had a plurality of voices and interpretations and practice more or less side by side. And however grudgingly acknowledging the validity of other interpretations, even if one disagrees with them.
You talk about this virtue of adab, is that right? Tell me what that is and what role that might have to play in what you see as a constructive way forward.
It's the key. It is the key. It just represents the core, humane, compassionate, selfless quality. It's unspoken most of the times. It's just something that you
And what
do.
is it? I mean, what's your definition of adab?
It's rooted in love, but it's when you act on love in a way that puts someone else before you. And so, you just have to give examples. When you travel in the Muslim world and you go to the tea houses and you're sitting down and someone brings out a tray of little cups, the host generally, will take the cup of tea and they'll put sugar in your cup before they put it in their own. And the reason they do this is that should somehow, heaven forbid, the sugar run out, they rather you have a sweet cup of tea than themselves. They put you before them.
Something that is important in what you've been saying and writing is that you're not only being critical of, let's say, injustice that has come to be part of some Islamic thought and action, but that you think it's important for Muslims to be mindful and critical of, you've used this phrase, the arrogance of modernity. Now, talk to me about that.
It's one of the paradigm shifts, I think, that is taking place in the ongoing interpretation of Islam. If you go back 50 years and you listen to what the liberal Muslims were saying, essentially it was idolizing modernity and saying that, we want to be as Western as possible, as modernized as possible, as scientific, rational, technological as possible, because that's what the Europeans are like.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of Americans are wanting Muslims to be desiring now, too.
That's correct. And I think what has happened with this emergence of the group that we're calling progressive Muslims is that we are exposing modernity to the same kind of critique that we are doing to our own tradition. So the idol of modernity has to be smashed. And in that sense, what we're saying is not fundamentally different from what post-colonials and postmoderns, if you would, in other conversations are saying. It's to say that there are incredibly powerful and profound things that take place in modernity, such as, the rise of scientific development and notions of democracy and human rights. but that these same developments also have a very dark and nasty underbelly.
Well, give me some examples of that.
Racism, the development of so much contemporary philosophy, going back to Kant and Hegel, is built on, I think, a profound sense of racism, of privileging sort of the white European as the embodiment of the rational self.
I want to note that you, again, have your large historical view, because you're talking about modernity as the last couple hundred years, right?
And maybe even more than that.
Okay.
Maybe even more than that. I would say maybe last 400 years.
All right. Okay.
In that sense.
Just to clarify that.
Yeah. And I think that, that kind of racism, the absolute environmental destruction that we have inflicted upon the world in a way that has never existed before, the legacy of colonialism. I mean, what is, after all, 19th century and, much of 20th century about other than colonizing 85% of the world? So modernity cannot, for us, be this entirely wholesome package that we must somehow download. It has to be critiqued. It has to be taken apart. That which is good and that which affirms the dignity of all humanity, not just some portions of humanity, is something that we will gladly tap into. But that which is racist and sexist and environmentally destructive, we will expose and we will not use and we will resist and we will work to undermine it and to replace it by something that's better. And it's that sense of grudgingly engaging both our own tradition and modernity to find the best elements of both that I think is new.
I'm Krista Tippett, and this is Speaking of Faith from American Public Media. One of the contributors to Omid Safi's book is Keisha Ali. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow in Islamic and women's studies at Brandeis University. She was previously the senior research analyst for the Islam section of the Feminist Sexual Ethics Project at Brandeis. There is a growing Islamic feminist voice. For example, earlier this year in New York, a Muslim woman and Islamic studies professor, Amina Wadud, led prayers at a service where men and women prayed together without the customary separation of a curtain. My guest, Keisha Ali, converted to Islam in young adulthood, but only after she decided that she could reconcile Islam's tenets with the fact that she had been feminist since she knew what the word meant.
The reality is that I don't think I have made my peace with everything contained in Islamic religious texts, and certainly not with everything that transpires in Muslim communities. But the rest of the world isn't a feminist paradise either. And I found the overall core of Islam, the overall core of the Quran's message, to be so convincingly egalitarian that the rest seemed to be, in some sense, just details.
These days, as Keisha Ali pursues such details by way of scholarship, she, like many Muslims, looks to the authoritative writings of classic Islamic jurists, especially from the 9th century. That tradition distinguishes between reading Islamic law and the work of interpreting and applying it in different lives and circumstances. That process, Keisha Ali says, is especially important for Muslim women. Some teachings in the Quran were not meant to be applied to all women or in every time. Here's a passage that shapes Keisha Ali's understanding.
The Quran says, اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا والنساء. Revere your Lord who created you from a single soul, نفس واحدة, and created from it its mate. وَخَلَقَ مِنْهَا زَوْجَهَا. It's literally created from her, because soul is a feminine word in Arabic, her mate. وَبَثَّ مِنْهُمَا, and from them spread رِجَالًا كَثِيرًا وَالنِّسَاء, many men and women. So this is a very important verse. It's the first verse in the chapter of the Quran entitled Women, Surah An-Nisa. It puts God first and foremost. Revere God. Maybe it puts humanity's worship of God first and foremost. Then it says, who created you from a single soul and created from this soul its mate, right? Its spouse. Mm-hmm. Now, many translations of the Quran say, God created man from a single soul and created his wife. But that isn't what the Quran says. In fact, I was once at a wedding where the man performing the ceremony read this verse in Arabic and then said, and the English translation of this is God created Adam. And out of Adam created Eve.
Did you stand up and say something?
I didn't. I bit my lip, but it was killing me to do it. So that concept of pairs and the concept of being created of the same soul and for each other is tremendously important. The Quran also says spouses are garments for one another, and it says men and women are each other's awliya, friends or protectors. So those verses provide a very important starting place.
And you are involved in this project at Brandeis, the Feminist Sexual Ethics Project. What is coming out of that project that also is enhancing this conversation we're talking about today and this subject of women?
Well, many things have come out of the project. I actually came on board to work on some web content related to Islam. So there's a bibliography, for example, and a series of links which go to other websites that provide a variety of interpretations on issues associated with wearing hijab, for example, or the interpretation of a couple of particularly thorny scriptural passages. You know, when you talk about the Quran, you have to distinguish between those verses that say things like, we created you from a single soul and created from it its mate, and things that say things like, husbands have a degree over their wives.
Right, and that's true of every sacred tradition. These contradictions exist in every tradition.
They absolutely are. But if you say, the Quran says, then, let's be honest about the full range of what the Quran says, both on the conservative side and on the progressive side. Let's be honest about the fact that Islam is a multifaceted tradition. The Quran may be the primary source for Muslims, but it is not the only one that is cited in discussions of what Islam says about a particular subject. And so it's been interesting for me and important for me to figure out how to bring all of those realms together. And that's even without bringing up the subject of what it is Muslims actually do and have done historically, which is a whole nother can of worms. Because if you say Islam says such and such, well, then what about the fact that, half the Muslims in the world may not do it that way? And how do you address that?
Precious Rashida Muhammad is founder and president of the Journal of Islam in America Press and founder of the Islam in America conferences at the Harvard Divinity School. I'm Krista Tippett, and this is Speaking of Faith from American Public Media. Today exploring the perspectives of progressive Muslims in America.
These are people who have a better opportunity than Muslims perhaps anywhere in the world to reclaim the core values of this faith.
Michael Wolff grew up in a mixed Jewish and Christian home and converted to Islam over 20 years ago. He published The Hajj, An American's Pilgrimage to Mecca, in 1993. After 9/11, he created the PBS documentary Muhammad, The Legacy of a Prophet, to explore the depths of Islamic faith that he found lacking in other media coverage. And he is the editor of a volume of essays by American Muslims entitled Taking Back Islam. In that volume, a number of authors draw parallels between the early history of Islam and Islam in America today. The Prophet Muhammad himself and his original followers left Mecca for freer lands like Medina and Abyssinia and flourished in other cultures. I asked Michael Wolff what he means when he writes that 10 years from now, the early 21st century may mark the time when American Muslims found their real voice.
The core values of Islam are in very good alliance, very close alliance with many of the core values of this country, including racial and religious pluralism, a sense of justice, a sense of equity, and to look back and see what's happened to people's lives all over the world since 9/11 has been a real impetus, I think, that pressure to distinguish a religious practice from the political rhetoric of a small group of disenchanted upper-middle-class anarchists.
And It's the energy, I think, that jumps out of these pages of the book, which you have edited, but which is in fact a collection of chapters written by many different kinds of Muslims from different countries, different cultures, different gender, and different perspectives. But it's an incredibly energetic group of essays.
Well, yes, and I think it's an urgency that's born of a deep concern. It's a kind of push. It's a common statement that the power of God is to pull good out of evil. The power of religious faith is to pull good out of evil, to reach into the center of something that is horrible and destructive, and to draw out of it by human effort and heart something that's positive.
If you could take me inside how Muslims, after that initial shock, began to speak among yourselves. You quote something, this wonderful phrase that I hadn't heard, that the Prophet Muhammad said, "Speak the truth even if it hurts you."
Yeah, and I always think the emphasis on that is even if it hurts you yourself. In other words, be honest enough to recognize that in a group, even a small group, there will be variations of good and bad and capable and harebrained and so on. And that in a group as large as 1/5 of the planet's population, for God's sake, at least have the humility to accept the fact that some in your group can go haywire. And then have the energy to define how that's happened and how you're different from them. I think that was a big hurdle for many Muslims here and abroad to get over, and many people are not over it yet. Mm-hmm. It's not an easy thing when you belong to a group that is traditionally victimized anyhow. I became a Muslim in the 80s. It was no cakewalk then, let me tell you. So after about a month or so, or 6 weeks of that, I began to hear people in mosques and on the telephone and writing emails and so on saying, well, we got more of a problem here than we think, or than we're saying. And really we need to look in, as Shakespeare says, look into your own foul heart. You want to straighten things out. And I believe that Muslims have been doing that. This is, after all, a religion of great candor, It's not a religion, even in its own foundational story, that goes in for a lot of mystery. And there's pretty good scholarship and a pretty good academic tradition in the Muslim world, always has been. And it's a very literate culture. And one of the most quoted phrases in the Quran is, "For people who think, for thinking people." This book is for thinking people. So, lo and behold, many people began to think and give some consideration to the various stripes and colors of Islam and to some of the defunct institutional aspects of the religion in various countries. Here in the States, we have really, by comparison, a nascent community. So it isn't surprising that a lot of this introspection and a lot of this public reconsideration would take place here.
Does that mean that also some of the baggage, some of the institutions which people want now to critique aren't so overwhelming in this country, for Muslims in this country?
Yeah, that's probably true, too. I think, though, largely it's just a matter of free speech. Honestly, I mean, there are a number of dictatorships in the Middle East and elsewhere where you're not free to speak, and where the religion is, be it whatever that religion is, and in these cases I'm talking about Islam, is essentially a state-run affair.
All right, so here the conversation is possible and the critical discussion can be out in the open.
Correct. And it can be developed. You don't do this sub rosa, in whispers. You have to develop a kind of conversation that has a chance to surface, spread, create courage in others to speak out as well.
Yeah.
This is not something that can take place in a day or a week. There has to be sufficient ground for the seeds to grow. And I think here you have a better possibility of that than, say, in, Egypt.
There's a very interesting proposition that someone makes in the book Taking Back Islam, Yahya Emmerich, is that how he'd say it?
Yes.
Who is an educator and a publisher. And I found this thought also, this was the theme that I felt was sort of under the surface in many of the writings in that book, that this notion that Islam in America is probably closer to the true teachings of the Prophet Muhammad than anywhere else at any other time in the last 500 years, or at least that it has the potential of being closer to those true teachings. And there are these interesting analogies being made between the original Muslims and Mecca and Medina. And it says we are in Meccan times today in the Muslim world. Islam has emigrated to safer lands.
Well, yes, it is true. This is a very powerful experience Muslims have undertaken to come to the United States. You know, this country does powerful things to people who arrive here and to the generations that follow. And no one knows what the effects of being in a free society, a relatively free society, will have on what you might call postmodern Islam, or whatever you want to call it, 21st century Islam.
Michael Wolff, he's the author of several books on his midlife conversion to Islam 2 decades ago. He's also the editor of a collection of essays titled Taking Back Islam. That book, Wolff writes, is composed by progressive, mostly American Muslims, people who are in love with Islam, who are proud of Islam, and who are confident enough in its strength to believe that it can stand up to honest introspection. Your final chapter is called Have Quran Will Travel, and you describe a dinner party. And I also find just a look inside this kind of more personal moment in the life of a Muslim, with professional people and good conversation, and I'm assuming good food around a long table and children running around. And the evening ends with prayer and a recitation of the Quran.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's quite common in just going to dinner to anybody's house. The short Quranic recitation is always incorporated in the prayer. So if you arrive between 5 and 7, you're probably going to be involved in that anyway. But then oftentimes, and particularly at high moments during the year like Ramadan, there'll be a recitation of a larger section of the Quran. It's very beautiful to listen to. I virtually have no Arabic, but I find it mesmerizing.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting to me to think of it being, I can imagine it as a traditional kind of entertainment, but to imagine it happening at an American dinner party is a new thought.
Absolutely. Well, this is why I would like to see in the next 5 years or so some books coming out by individual Muslims talking about their lives here, because there is the most fascinating mixture of traditional and contemporary living going on in the Muslim community right now. There are computer programs that will set your clock for you so that you know when it's the time to pray. You can go online now and hear the call to prayer from the Grand Mosque in Mecca, the kind of heartland of Islam. There are all kinds of interesting combinations of the traditional and the very modern that are taking place. And it's an interesting moment right now in our society. And I hope that in addition to essays by apologists, by reformists, by progressive Muslims, and everything else, I hope also that people will begin to register their actual lives in print, because it's a very interesting time right now. I don't know what Islam will look like in